Muhammad, 570 to 632. 1. Arabia. The rediscovery of Arabia by modern Europeans illustrates the internationalism of science in the 19th century. It began in 1761 to 64, when Carsten Niebuhr traveled through the peninsula under the auspices of the Danish government. His published account of 1772 was the first comprehensive description of Arabia. In 1807, Domingo Badia y Leblich, a Spaniard disguised as a Moor, visited Mecca and gave the first accurate account of the pilgrimage ritual. In 1814 to 1815, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss disguised as a Moslem, spent several months in Mecca and Medina. His learned reports were corroborated by later travelers. In 1853, Richard Burton, an Englishman dressed as an Afghan pilgrim, visited Medina and Mecca and described his perilous journey in 2 absorbing volumes. In 1869 to 1870, J. Alevi, a French Jew, explored the sites and recorded the rock inscriptions of the ancient Minian, Sabaean, and Himyarite kingdoms. In 1875, Charles Montague Doughty, an Englishman, traveled from Damascus in the pilgrimage caravan and recorded his vicissitudes in Arabia Deserta of 1888, one of the peaks of English prose. In 1882 to 1888, E. Glaser, an Austrian, in 3 arduous expeditions, copied 1,032 inscriptions, which are now our chief source for the history of pre-Islamic Arabia. In the year 565, Justinian died, master of a great empire. 5 years later, Muhammad was born into a poor family in a country 3/4 desert, sparsely peopled by nomad tribes whose total wealth could hardly have furnished the sanctuary of St. Sophia. No one in those years would have dreamed that within a century these nomads would conquer half of Byzantine Asia, all Persia and Egypt, most of North Africa, and be on their way to Spain. The explosion of the Arabian Peninsula into the conquest and conversion of half the Mediterranean world is the most extraordinary phenomenon in medieval history. Arabia is the largest of all peninsulas. 1,400 miles in its greatest length, 1,250 in its greatest width. Geologically, it is a continuation of the Sahara, part of the sandy belt that runs up through Persia to the Gobi Desert. Arab means arid. Physically, Arabia is a vast plateau, rising precipitously to 12,000 feet within 30 miles of the Red Sea, and sloping through mountainous wastelands eastward to the Persian Gulf. In the center are some grassy oases and palm-studded villages where water can be reached by shallow wells. Around this nucleus, the sands stretch in every direction for hundreds of miles. Snow falls there once in 40 years. The nights cool down to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the daily sun burns the face and boils the blood, and the sand-laden air necessitates long robes and headbands to guard flesh and hair. The skies are almost always clear, the air like sparkling wine. Along the coasts, an occasional torrent of rain brings the possibility of civilization. Most of all on the western littoral, in the Hijaz district with the cities of Mecca and Medina, and southwest in the district of Yemen, the home of the ancient kingdoms of Arabia. A Babylonian inscription of approximately 2400 B.C. records the defeat of a king of Magan by the Babylonian ruler Naram-Sin. Magan was the capital of a Minian kingdom in southwest Arabia. 25 of its later kings are known from Arabian inscriptions that go back to 800 B.C. An inscription tentatively ascribed to 2300 B.C. mentions another Arabian kingdom, Saba, in Yemen. From Saba, or its North Arabian colonies, it is now agreed the Queen of Sheba went up to Solomon about 950 B.C. The Sabaean kings made their capital at Marib, fought the usual wars of defense, built great irrigation works like the Marib dams, whose ruins are still visible, raised gigantic castles and temples, subsidized religion handsomely, and used it as an instrument of rule. Their inscriptions, probably not older than 900 B.C., are beautifully carved in an alphabetical script. The Sabaeans produced the frankincense and myrrh that played so prominent a role in Asiatic and Egyptian rituals. They controlled the sea trade between India and Egypt, and the south end of the caravan route that led through Mecca and Medina to Petra and Jerusalem. About 115 B.C., another petty kingdom of southwest Arabia, the Himyarite, conquered Saba, and thereafter controlled Arabian trade for several centuries. In 25 BC, Augustus, irked by Arabian control of Egyptian-Indian commerce, sent an army under Aelius Gallus to capture Marib. The legions were misled by native guides, were decimated by heat and disease, and failed in their mission. But another Roman army captured the Arab port of Adana, now Aden, and gave control of the Egypt-India route to Rome. Britain repeated this procedure in our time. In the 2nd century before Christ, some Himyarites crossed the Red Sea, colonized Abyssinia, and gave the indigenous Negro population a Semitic culture and considerable Semitic blood. The term Semitic is due to the legendary derivation of the peoples so-called from Shem, son of Noah. No clear definition of Semite can be given. In general, the populations of Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, and the Arab populations of Africa may be called Semitic in the sense that they use Semitic languages. The ancient peoples of Asia Minor, Armenia, and the Caucasus, and the peoples of Persia, North India, most of Europe, and all of the Europeanized Americas may be called Indo-European, as using Indo-Germanic tongues. The Abyssinians received Christianity, crafts, and arts from Egypt and Byzantium. Their merchant vessels sailed as far as India and Ceylon, and 7 little kingdoms acknowledged the Negus as their sovereign. Meanwhile, in Arabia, many Himyarites followed the lead of their king Dunuas and accepted Judaism. With a convert's zeal, Dunuas persecuted the Christians of southwest Arabia. They called to their co-religionists to rescue them. The Abyssinians came, conquered the Himyarite kings around AD 522, and replaced them with an Abyssinian dynasty. Justinian allied himself with this new state. Persia countered by taking up the cause of the deposed Himyarites, driving out the Abyssinians and setting up in Yemen in 575 a Persian rule that ended some 60 years later with the Muslim conquest of Persia. In the north, some minor Arab kingdoms flourished briefly. The sheikhs of the Ghassanid tribe ruled northwestern Arabia and Palmyra in Syria from the 3rd to the 7th century as phylarchs or client kings of Byzantium. During the same period, the Lakhmid kings established at Hira, near Babylon, a semi-Persian court and culture famous for its music and poetry. Long before Muhammad, the Arabs had expanded into Syria and Iraq. Aside from these petty kingdoms of south and north, and to a large extent within them, the political organization of pre-Islamic Arabia was a primitive kinship structure of families united in clans and tribes. Tribes were named from a supposed common ancestor, so the Banu Ghassan thought themselves the children of Ghassan. Arabia as a political unit, before Muhammad, existed only in the careless nomenclature of the Greeks, who called all the population of the peninsula Sarakenoi, or Saracens, apparently from the Arabic Sharkiyun, Easterners. Difficulties of communication compelled local or tribal self-sufficiency and particularism. The Arab felt no duty or loyalty to any group larger than his tribe, but the intensity of his devotion varied inversely as its extent. For his tribe he would do with a clear conscience what civilized people do only for their country, religion, or race, that is, lie, steal, kill, and die. Each tribe or clan was loosely ruled by a sheikh chosen by its leaders from a family traditionally prominent through wealth or wisdom or war. In the villages, men coaxed some grains and vegetables from the unwilling soil, raised a few cattle, and bred some fine horses. But they found it more profitable to cultivate orchards of dates, peaches, apricots, pomegranates, lemons, oranges, bananas, and figs. Some nursed aromatic plants like frankincense, thyme, jasmine, and lavender. Some pressed ether, or attar, from highland roses. Some cupped trees to draw myrrh or balsam from the trunks. Possibly 1/12 of the population lived in cities on or near the west coast. Here was a succession of harbors and markets for Red Sea commerce, while farther inland lay the great caravan routes to Syria. We hear of Arabian trade with Egypt as far back as 2743 B.C. Probably as ancient was the trade with India. Annual fairs called merchants now to one town, now to another. The great annual fair at Ukaz near Mecca brought together hundreds of merchants, actors, preachers, gamblers, poets, and prostitutes. 5/6 of the population were nomad Bedouins, herdsmen who moved with their flocks from one pasture land to another according to season and the winter rains. The Bedouin loved horses, but in the desert the camel was his greatest friend. It pitched and rolled with undulant dignity and made only 8 miles an hour. But it could go without water 5 days in summer and 25 in winter. Its udders gave milk, its urine provided a hair tonic, its dung could be burned for fuel. The nomad women, says Doughty, wash their babies in camel urine and think thus to help them from insects, and in this water both men and women comb their long hair. When it died, it made tender meat, and its hair and hide made clothing and tents. With such varied sustenance, the Bedouin could face the desert, as patient and enduring as his camel, as sensitive and spirited as his horse. Short and thin, well-knit and strong, he could live day after day on a few dates and a little milk. And from dates he made the wine that raised him out of the dust into romance. He varied the routine of his life with love and feud, and was as quick as a Spaniard, who inherited his blood, to avenge insult and injury, not only for himself but for his clan. A good part of his life was spent in tribal war, and when he conquered Syria, Persia, Egypt, and Spain, it was but an exuberant expansion of his plundering razzias or raids. Certain periods in the year he conceded to the Holy Truce for religious pilgrimage or for trade. Otherwise he felt the desert was his. Whoever crossed it except in that time or without paying him tribute was an interloper. To rob such trespassers was an unusually straightforward form of taxation. He despised the city because it meant law and trade. He loved the merciless desert because it left him free. Kindly and murderous, generous and avaricious, dishonest and faithful, cautious and brave, the Bedouin, however poor, fronted the world with dignity and pride, vain of the purity of his inbred blood and fond of adding his lineage to his name. On one point above all he brooked no argument, and that was the incomparable beauty of his women. It was a dark, fierce, consuming beauty, worth 1,000,000 odes, but brief with the tragic, hasty fading of hot climes. Before Mohammed, and after him only slightly less so, the career of the Arab woman passed from a moment's idolatry to a lifetime of drudgery. She might be buried at birth if the father so willed. At best he mourned her coming and hid his face from his fellows. Somehow his best efforts had failed. Her winsome childhood earned a few years of love, but at 7 or 8 she was married off to any youth of the clan whose father would offer the purchase price for the bride. Her lover and husband would fight the world to defend her person or honor. Some of the seeds and fustian of chivalry went with these passionate lovers to Spain. But the goddess was also a chattel. She formed part of the estate of her father, her husband, or her son, and was bequeathed with it. She was always the servant, rarely the comrade, of the man. He demanded many children of her, or rather many sons. Her duty was to produce warriors. She was in many cases but one of his many wives. He could dismiss her at any time at will. Nevertheless, her mysterious charms rivaled battle as a theme and stimulus for his verse. The pre-Moslem Arab was usually illiterate, but he loved poetry only next to horses, women, and wine. He had no scientists or historians, but he had a heady passion for eloquence, for fine and correct speech, and intricately patterned verse. His language was closely kin to the Hebrew, complex in inflections, rich in vocabulary, precise in differentiations, expressing now every nuance of poetry, later every subtlety of philosophy. The Arabs took pride in the antiquity and fullness of their language, loved to roll its mellifluous syllables in oratorical flourishes on tongue or pen, and listened with tense ecstasy to the poets who, in villages and cities, in desert camps or at the fairs, recalled to them in running meters and endless rhymes the loves and wars of their heroes, tribes, or kings. The poet was to the Arabs their historian, genealogist, satirist, moralist, newspaper, oracle, call to battle, and when a poet won a prize at one of the many poetry contests, his whole tribe felt honored and rejoiced. Every year at the Ukaz Fair, the greatest of these contests was held. Almost daily for a month, the clans competed through their poets. There were no judges but the eagerly or scornfully listening multitudes. The winning poems were written down in brilliantly illuminated characters, were therefore called the Golden Songs, and were preserved like heirlooms in the treasuries of princes and kings. The Arabs called them also mu'allakat, or suspended, because legend said that the prize poems, inscribed upon Egyptian silk and letters of gold, were hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Mecca. 7 such mu'allakat, dating from the 6th century, survived from those pre-Islamic days. Their form is the qasida, a narrative ode in elaborately complex meter and rhyme, usually of love or war. In one of them, by the poet Labid, a soldier returns from his campaigns to the village and home where he had left his wife. He finds his cottage empty, his wife gone off with another man. Labid describes the scene with goldsmith's tenderness, and with greater eloquence and force. In another, the Arab women prod their men to battle. "Courage, courage, defenders of women! Smite with the edge of your swords. We are the daughters of the morning star. Soft are the carpets we tread beneath our feet. Our necks are adorned with pearls, our tresses are perfumed with musk. The brave who confront the foe we will clasp to our bosoms, but the dastards who flee we will spurn. Not for them our embraces." Unabashedly sensual is an ode by Imrul Qais. Fair too was that other, she the veil-hidden one, howded, how close, how guarded. Yet did she welcome me. Passed I twixt her tent ropes. What though her near of kin lay in the dark to slay me, bloodshedders all of them? Came I at the midnight, hour when the Pleiades showed as the links of seed pearls binding the sky's girdle. Stealing in, I stood there. She had cast off from her every robe but one robe, all but her night garment. Tenderly she scolded, "What is this stratagem? Speak on thine oath, thou mad one, stark is thy lunacy." Passed we out together while she drew after us, on our twin track, to hide it, wise her embroideries. Fled beyond the campfires. There in security dark in the sand, we lay down far from the prying eyes. By her plaits I wooed her, drew her face near to me, one to her waist how frail-lined, hers of the ankle rings. Fair-faced she, no redness, noble of countenance, smooth as of glass her bosom, bare with its necklaces. Thus are pearls yet virgin, seen through the dark water, clear in the sea depths gleaming, pure, inaccessible. Coyly she withdraws her, shows us a cheek, a lip, she a gazelle of Wudra. Roe-like her throat slender, white as an Ariel's, sleek to thy lips uplifted, pearls are its ornament. On her shoulders fallen thick lie the locks of her, dark as the date clusters hung from the palm branches. Slim her waist, a well-cord scarce has its slenderness. Smooth are her legs as reed stems stripped at a waterhead. The morn through she sleepeth, muck-stream in indolence, hardly at noon hath risen, girded her day-dresses. Soft her touch, her fingers fluted as water-worms, sleek as the snakes of Thobia, tooth-sticks of Ishali. Lighteneth she night's darkness, aye, as an evening lamp hung for a sign of guidance lone on a hermitage. The pre-Islamic poets sang their compositions to musical accompaniment. Music and poetry were bound into one form. The flute, the lute, the reed pipe or oboe, and the tambourine were the favored instruments. Singing girls were often invited to amuse male banqueteers. Taverns were equipped with them. The Ghassanid kings kept a troop of them to ease the cares of royalty. And when the Meccans marched against Muhammad in 624, they took with them a bevy of singing girls to warm their campfires and prod them on to war. Even in those early days of ignorance, as Muslims would call the pre-Muslim period, the Arab song was a plaintive cantilena that used few words and carried a note so tenaciously along the upper reaches of the scale that a few verses might provide libretto for an hour. The desert Arab had his own primitive and yet subtle religion. He feared and worshipped incalculable deities in stars and moon and the depths of the earth. Occasionally he importuned the mercy of a punitive sky, but for the most part he was so confused by the swarm of spirits, or jinn, about him that he despaired of appeasing them, accepted a fatalistic resignation, prayed with masculine brevity, and shrugged his shoulders over the infinite. He seems to have given scant thought to a life after death. Sometimes, however, he had his camel tied foodless to his grave, so that it might soon follow him to the other world and save him from the social disgrace of going on foot in paradise. Now and then he offered human sacrifice, and here and there he worshipped sacred stones. The center of this stone worship was Mecca. This holy city owed none of its growth to climate, for the mountains of bare rock that almost enclosed it ensured a summer of intolerable heat. The valley was an arid waste, and in all the town, as Muhammad knew it, hardly a garden grew. But its location, halfway down the west coast, 48 miles from the Red Sea, made it a convenient stopping point for the mile-long caravans, sometimes of 1,000 camels, that carried trade between southern Arabia, and therefore India and Central Africa, and Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. The merchants who controlled this trade formed joint stock companies, dominated the fairs at Ukaz, and managed the lucrative religious ritual that centered around the Kaaba and its sacred black stone. Kaaba means a square structure and is one with our word cube. In the belief of Orthodox Muslims, the Kaaba was built or rebuilt 10 times. The first was erected at the dawn of history by angels from heaven, the second by Adam, the third by his son Seth, the fourth by Abraham and his son Ishmael by Hagar, the seventh by Qusay, chief of the Quraysh tribe, the eighth by the Quraysh leaders in Muhammad's lifetime, around 605, the ninth and 10th by Muslim leaders in 681 and 696. The 10th is substantially the Kaaba of today. It stands near the center of a large porticoed enclosure, the Masjid al-Haram, or Sacred Mosque. It is a rectangular stone edifice 40 feet long, 35 feet wide, 50 high. In its southeast corner, 5 feet from the ground, just right for kissing, is embedded the black stone, of dark red material, oval in shape, some 7 inches in diameter. Many of its worshippers believe that this stone was sent down from heaven, and perhaps it was a meteorite. Most of them believe that it has been a part of the Kaaba since Abraham. Muslim scholars interpret it as symbolizing that part of Abraham's progeny, Ishmael and his offspring, which, rejected by Israel, became, they think, the founders of the Quraysh tribe. They apply to it a passage from Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23. The stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This is Yahweh's doing. And another from Matthew chapter 21, verses 42 to 43, in which Jesus, having quoted these strange words, adds, "Therefore the kingdom of God shall be taken away from you, and shall be given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof," though the Vero Muslims would hardly claim to have fulfilled the ethics of Christ. Within the Kaaba in pre-Muslim days were several idols representing gods. One was called Allah, and was probably the tribal god of the Quraysh. 3 others were Allah's daughters, Al-Uzza, Al-Lat, and Mana. We may judge the antiquity of this Arab pantheon from the mention of Al-Ilat, or Al-Lat, by Herodotus as a major Arabian deity. The Quraysh paved the way for monotheism by worshipping Allah as chief god. He was represented to the Meccans as the lord of their soil, to whom they must pay a tithe of their crops and the firstborn of their herds. The Quraysh, as alleged descendants of Abraham and Ishmael, appointed the priests and guardians of the shrine and managed its revenues. An aristocratic minority of the tribe, as descendants of Qusay, controlled the civil government of Mecca. At the beginning of the 6th century, the Quraysh were divided into 2 factions, one led by the rich merchant and philanthropist Hashim, the other by Hashim's jealous nephew, Umayyah. This bitter rivalry would determine much history. When Hashim died, he was succeeded as one of Mecca's chiefs by his son or younger brother, Abd al-Muttalib. In 568, the latter's son, Abdallah, married Amina, also a descendant of Qusay. Abdallah remained with his bride 3 days, set out on a mercantile expedition, and died at Medina on the way back. 2 months later, in 569, Amina was delivered of the most important figure in medieval history. 2. Muhammad in Mecca, 569 to 622. His ancestry was distinguished, his patrimony modest. Abdallah had left him 5 camels, a flock of goats, a house, and a slave who nursed him in his infancy. His name, meaning highly praised, lent itself well to certain biblical passages as predicting his advent. His mother died when he was 6. He was taken over by his grandfather, then 76, and later by his uncle, Abu Talib. They gave him affection and care, but no one seems to have bothered to teach him how to read or write. This feeble accomplishment was held in low repute by the Arabs of the time. Only 17 men of the Quraysh tribe condescended to it. Muhammad was never known to write anything himself. He used an amanuensis. His apparent illiteracy did not prevent him from composing the most famous and eloquent book in the Arabic tongue, and from acquiring such understanding of the management of men as seldom comes to highly educated persons. Of his youth we know almost nothing, though fables about it have filled 10,000 volumes. At the age of 12, says a tradition, he was taken by Abu Talib on a caravan to Basra in Syria. Perhaps on that journey he picked up some Jewish and Christian lore. Another tradition pictures him, a few years later, as going to Basra on mercantile business for the rich widow Khadijah. Then suddenly we find him, aged 25, marrying her, aged 40, and mother of several children. Until her death 26 years later, Muhammad lived with Khadijah in a monogamous condition highly unusual for a Moslem of means, but perhaps natural in their recipient. She bore him some daughters, of whom the most famous was Fatima, and 2 sons who died in infancy. He consoled his grief by adopting Ali, the orphan son of Abu Talib. Khadija was a good woman, a good wife, a good merchant. She remained loyal to Muhammad through all his spiritual vicissitudes, and amid all his wives he remembered her as the best. Ali, who married Fatima, fondly describes his adoptive father at 45 as of middle stature, neither tall nor short. His complexion was rosy white. His eyes black, his hair, thick, brilliant, and beautiful, fell to his shoulders. His profuse beard fell to his breast. There was such sweetness in his visage that no one, once in his presence, could leave him. If I hungered, a single look at the Prophet's face dispelled the hunger. Before him all forgot their griefs and pains. He was a man of dignity and seldom laughed. He kept his keen sense of humor under control, knowing its hazards for public men. Of a delicate constitution, he was nervous, impressionable, given to melancholy pensiveness. In moments of excitement or anger, his facial veins could swell alarmingly, but he knew when to abate his passion and could readily forgive a disarmed and repentant foe. There were many Christians in Arabia, some in Mecca. With at least one of these, Muhammad became intimate, Khadija's cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who knew the scriptures of the Hebrews and the Christians. Muhammad frequently visited Medina, where his father had died. There he may have met some of the Jews who formed a large part of the population. Many a page of the Qur'an proves that he learned to admire the morals of the Christians, the monotheism of the Jews, and the strong support given to Christianity and Judaism by the possession of scriptures, believed to be a revelation from God. Compared with these faiths, the polytheistic idolatry, loose morality, tribal warfare, and political disunity of Arabia may have seemed to him shamefully primitive. He felt the need of a new religion, perhaps one that would unify all these factious groups into a virile and healthy nation. A religion that would give them a morality not earthbound to the Bedouin law of violence and revenge, but based upon commandments of divine origin, and therefore of indisputable force. Others may have had similar thoughts. We hear of several prophets arising in Arabia about the beginning of the 7th century. Many Arabs had been influenced by the messianic expectations of the Jews. They too eagerly awaited a messenger from God. One Arab sect, the Hanifs, already rejected the heathen idolatry of the Kaaba and preached a universal God of whom all mankind should be willing slaves. Like every successful preacher, Muhammad gave voice and form to the need and longing of his time. As he approached 40, he became more and more absorbed in religion. During the holy month of Ramadan, he would withdraw, sometimes with his family, to a cave at the foot of Mount Hira, 3 miles from Mecca, and spent many days and nights in fasting, meditation, and prayer. One night in the year 610, as he was alone in the cave, the pivotal experience of all Mohammedan history came to him. According to a tradition reported by his chief biographer, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, Muhammad related the event as follows. Whilst I was asleep, with a coverlet of silk brocade whereon was some writing, the angel Gabriel appeared to me and said, "Read." I said, "I do not read." He pressed me with the coverlets so tightly that methought 'twas death. Then he let me go and said, "Read." So I read aloud, and he departed from me at last. And I awoke from my sleep, and it was as though these words were written on my heart. I went forth until, when I was midway on the mountain, I heard a voice from heaven saying, "O Muhammad, thou art the messenger of Allah, and I am Gabriel." I raised my head toward heaven to see, and lo, Gabriel in the form of a man, with feet set evenly on the rim of the sky, saying, "O Muhammad, thou art the messenger of Allah, and I am Gabriel." Returning to Khadija, he informed her of the visions. We are told that she accepted them as a true revelation from heaven and encouraged him to announce his mission. Thereafter he had many similar visions. Often, when they came, he fell to the ground in a convulsion or swoon. Perspiration covered his brow. Even the camel on which he was sitting felt the excitement and moved fitfully. Muhammad later attributed his gray hairs to these experiences. When pressed to describe the process of revelation, he answered that the entire text of the Qur'an existed in heaven, and that one fragment at a time was communicated to him, usually by Gabriel. Asked how he could remember these divine discourses, he explained that the archangel made him repeat every word. Others who were near the prophet at the time neither saw nor heard the angel. Possibly his convulsions were epileptic seizures. They were sometimes accompanied by a sound reported by him as like the ringing of a bell, a frequent occurrence in epileptic fits. But we hear of no tongue-biting, no loss of prehensile strength, such as usually occurs in epilepsy. Nor does Muhammad's history show that degeneration of brain power which epilepsy generally brings. On the contrary, he advanced in clarity of thought and in confident leadership and power until his 60th year. The evidence is inconclusive. At least it has not sufficed to convince any orthodox Mohammedan. During the next 4 years, Muhammad more and more openly announced himself as the prophet of Allah, divinely commissioned to lead the Arab people to a new morality and a monotheistic faith. Difficulties were many. New ideas are welcomed only if promising early material advantage, and Muhammad lived in a mercantile, skeptical community which derived some of its revenues from pilgrims coming to worship the Kaaba's many gods. Against this handicap he made some progress by offering to believers an escape from a threatened hell into a joyous and tangible paradise. He opened his house to all who would hear him, rich and poor and slaves, Arabs and Christians and Jews. His impassioned eloquence moved a few to belief. His first convert was his aging wife, the second his cousin Ali, the third his servant Zaid, whom he had bought as a slave and had immediately freed. The fourth was his kinsman, Abu Bakr, a man of high standing among the Quraysh. Abu Bakr brought to the new faith 5 other Meccan leaders. He and these became the Prophet's 6 companions, whose memories of him would later constitute the most revered traditions of Islam. Muhammad went often to the Kaaba, accosted pilgrims, and preached the one God. The Quraysh heard him at first with smiling patience, called him a half-wit, and proposed to send him at their own expense to a physician who might cure him of his madness. But when he attacked the Kaaba worship as idolatry, they rose to the protection of their income and would have done him injury had not his uncle Abu Talib shielded him. Abu Talib would have none of the new faith, but his very fidelity to old ways required him to defend any member of his clan. Fear of a blood feud deterred the Quraysh from using violence upon Muhammad or his freeman followers. Upon converted slaves, however, they might employ dissuasive measures without offending tribal law. Several of these were jailed, some were exposed for hours without head covering or drink to the glare of the sun. Abu Bakr had by years of commerce saved 40,000 pieces of silver. He now used 35,000 to buy the freedom of as many converted slaves as he could, and Muhammad eased the situation by ruling that recantation under duress was forgivable. The Quraysh were more disturbed by Muhammad's welcome to slaves than by his religious creed. Persecution of the poorer converts continued, and with such severity that the Prophet permitted or advised their emigration to Abyssinia. The refugees were well received there by the Christian king in 615. A year later, an event occurred which was almost as significant for Mohammedanism as the conversion of Paul had been for Christianity. Omar ibn al-Khattab, hitherto a most violent opponent, was won over to the new creed. He was a man of great physical strength, social power, and moral courage. His allegiance brought timely confidence to the harassed believers and new adherence to the cause. Instead of hiding their worship in private homes, they now preached it boldly in the streets. The defenders of the Kaaba gods formed a league pledged to renounce all intercourse with members of the Hashemite clan who still felt obligated to shield Muhammad. To avert conflict, many Hashemites, including Muhammad and his family, withdrew to a secluded quarter of Mecca, where Abu Talib could provide protection, this in 615. For over 2 years this separation of the clans continued, until some members of the Quraysh, relenting, invited the Hashemites to return to their deserted homes and pledged them peace. The little group of converts rejoiced, but the year 619 brought triple misfortune to Muhammad. Khadija, his most loyal supporter, and Abu Talib, his protector, died. Feeling insecure in Mecca, and discouraged by the slow increase of his followers there, Muhammad moved to Taif in 620, a pleasant town 60 miles east. But Taif rejected him. Its leaders did not care to offend the merchant aristocracy of Mecca. Its populace, horrified by any religious innovation, hooted him through the streets and pelted him with stones until blood flowed from his legs. Back in Mecca, he married the widow Sauda, and betrothed himself, aged 50, to Aisha, the pretty and petulant 7-year-old daughter of Abu Bakr. Meanwhile his visions continued. One night it seemed to him he was miraculously transported in his sleep to Jerusalem. There a winged horse, Burak, awaited him at the Wailing Wall of the Jewish temple ruins, flew him to heaven and back again. and by another miracle the prophet found himself the next morning safe in his Mecca bed. The legend of this flight made Jerusalem a third holy city for Islam. In the year 620, Muhammad preached to merchants who had come from Medina on pilgrimage to the Kaaba. They heard him with some acceptance, for the doctrine of monotheism, a divine messenger, and the Last Judgment were familiar to them from the creed of the Medina Jews. Returning to their city, some of them expounded the new gospel to their friends. Several Jews, seeing little difference between Muhammad's teaching and their own, gave it a tentative welcome. And in 622, some 73 citizens of Medina came privately to Muhammad and invited him to make Medina his home. He asked would they protect him as faithfully as their own families. They vowed they would, but asked what reward they would receive should they be killed in the process. He answered, paradise. About this time, Abu Sufyan, grandson of Umayyah, became the head of the Meccan Quraysh. Having been brought up in an odor of hatred for all descendants of Hashim, he renewed the persecution of Muhammad's followers. Possibly he had heard that the Prophet was meditating flight and feared that Muhammad, once established in Medina, might stir it to war against Mecca and the Kaaba cult. At his urging, the Quraysh commissioned some of their number to apprehend Muhammad, perhaps to kill him. Apprised of the plot, Muhammad fled with Abu Bakr to the cave of Thawr, a league distant. The Quraysh emissaries sought them for 3 days, but failed to find them. The children of Abu Bakr brought camels, and the two men rode northward through the night and through many days for 200 miles, until on September 24, 622, they arrived at Medina. 200 Meccan adherents had preceded them in the guise of departing pilgrims, and stood at the city's gates, with the Medina converts to welcome the Prophet. 17 years later, the Caliph Omar designated the first day, July 16, 622, of the Arabian year, in which this Hijra, from Hijra, or flight, took place as the official beginning of the Mohammedan era. 3. Muhammad in Medina, 622 to 630. The city hitherto called Yathrib, later renamed Madinat al-Nabi, or City of the Prophet, was situated on the western edge of the central Arabian plateau. Compared with Mecca, it was a climatic Eden, with hundreds of gardens, palm groves, and farms. As Muhammad rode into the town, one group after another called to him, "Alight here, O Prophet! Abide with us!" And with Arab persistence, some caught the halter of his camel to detain him. His answer was perfect diplomacy. "The choice lies with the camel. Let him advance freely." The advice quieted jealousy and hallowed his new residence as chosen by God. Where his camel stopped, Muhammad built a mosque and 2 adjoining homes, one for Sauda, one for Aisha. Later he added new apartments as he took new wives. In leaving Mecca, he had snapped many kinship ties. Now he tried to replace bonds of blood with those of religious brotherhood in a theocratic state. To mitigate the jealousy already rampant between the refugees, or muhajirin, from Mecca and the helpers, or ansar, or converts, in Medina, he coupled each member of the one group with a member of the other in adoptive brotherhood, and called both groups to worship in sacred union in the mosque. In the first ceremony held there, he mounted the pulpit and cried in a loud voice, "Allah is most great." The assembly burst forth in the same proclamation. Then, still standing with his back to the congregation, he bowed in prayer. He descended the pulpit backward, and at its foot he prostrated himself thrice, while continuing to pray. In these prostrations were symbolized that submission of the soul to Allah, which gave to the new faith its name, Islam, to surrender, to make peace, and to its adherents the kindred name of Muslimin, or Moslems, the surrendering ones, those who have made their peace with God. Turning then to the assembly, Muhammad bade it observe this ritual to the end of time, and to this day it is the form of prayer that Moslems follow, whether at the mosque or traveling in the desert, or mosqueless in alien lands. A sermon completed the ceremony, often announcing, in Muhammad's case, a new revelation and directing the actions and policies of the week. For the authority of the Prophet was creating a civic rule for Medina, and more he was compelled to address his time and inspirations to the practical problems of social organization, daily morals, even to intertribal diplomacy and war. As in Judaism, no distinction was made between secular and religious affairs. all alike came under religious jurisdiction. He was both Caesar and Christ. But not all Medinites accepted his authority. A majority of the Arabs stood aside as the disaffected, viewed the new creed and its rituals skeptically, and wondered whether Muhammad was destroying their traditions and liberties and involving them in war. Most of the Medina Jews clung to their own faith and continued to trade with the Meccan Quraysh. Muhammad drew up with these Jews a subtle concordat. The Jews who attach themselves to our commonwealth shall be protected from all insults and vexations. They shall have an equal right with our own people to our assistance and good offices. They shall form with the Moslems one composite nation. They shall practice their religion as freely as the Moslems. They shall join the Moslems in defending Yathrib against all enemies. All future disputes between those who accept this charter shall be referred, under God, to the Prophet. This agreement was soon accepted by all the Jewish tribes of Medina and the surrounding country, the Banu Nadir, the Banu Qurayza, the Banu Kainuka, etc. The immigration of 200 Meccan families created a food shortage in Medina. Muhammad solved the problem as starving people do, by taking food where it could be had. In commissioning his lieutenants to raid the caravans that passed Medina, he was adopting the morals of most Arab tribes in his time. When the raids succeeded, 4/5 of the spoils went to the raiders, 1/5 to the Prophet for religious and charitable uses. The share of a slain raider went to his widow, and he himself at once entered paradise. So encouraged, raids and raiders multiplied, while the merchants of Mecca, whose economic life depended on the security of the caravans, plotted revenge. One raid scandalized Medina as well as Mecca, for it took place and killed a man on the last day of Rajab, one of the sacred months when Arab morality laid a moratorium on violence. In 623, Muhammad himself organized a band of 300 armed men to waylay a rich caravan coming from Syria to Mecca. Abu Sufyan, who commanded the caravan, got wind of the plan, changed his route, and sent to Mecca for help. The Quraysh came 900 strong. The miniature armies met at the Wadi Bedr, 20 miles south of Medina. If Muhammad had been defeated, his career might have ended there and then. He personally led his men to victory, ascribed it to Allah as a miracle confirming his leadership, and returned to Medina with rich booty and many prisoners, this in January 624. Some of these, who had been especially active in the persecution at Mecca, were put to death. The rest were freed for lucrative ransoms. But Abu Sufyan survived and promised revenge. "Weep not for your slain," he told mourning relatives in Mecca, "and let no bard bewail their fate. Haply the turn may come, and ye may obtain vengeance. As for me, I will touch no oil, neither approach my wife until I shall have gone forth again to fight Muhammad." Strengthened by victory, Muhammad used the customary morality of war. Asma, a Medinese poetess, having attacked him in her rhymes, Umayr, a blond Moslem, made his way into a room and plunged his sword so fervently into the sleeping woman's breast that it affixed her to the couch. In the mosque the next morning, Muhammad asked Umayr, "Hast thou slain Asma?" "Yes," answered Umayr. "Is there cause for apprehension?" "None," said the Prophet. "A couple of goats will hardly knock their heads together for it." Afaq, a centenarian convert to Judaism, composed a satire on the Prophet and was slain as he slept in his courtyard. A third Medinese poet, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, son of a Jewess, abandoned Islam when Muhammad turned against the Jews. He wrote verses prodding the Quraysh to avenge their defeat and enraged the Moslems by addressing love sonnets to their wives in premature troubadour style. "Who will ease me of this man?" asked Muhammad. That evening the poet's severed head was laid at the Prophet's feet. In the Moslem view, these executions were a legitimate defense against treason. Muhammad was the head of a state and had full authority to condemn. The Jews of Medina no longer liked this warlike faith, which had once seemed so flatteringly kindred to their own. They laughed at Muhammad's interpretations of their scriptures and his claim to be the Messiah promised by their prophets. He retaliated with revelations in which Allah charged the Jews with corrupting the scriptures, killing the prophets, and rejecting the Messiah. Originally, he had made Jerusalem the Qibla, the point toward which Muslims should turn in prayer. In 624, he changed this to Mecca and the Kaaba. The Jews accused him of returning to idolatry. About this time, a Moslem girl visited the market of the Banu Kainuka Jews in Medina. As she sat in a goldsmith's shop, a mischievous Jew pinned her skirt behind to her upper dress. When she arose, she cried out in shame at her exposure. A Moslem slew the offending Jew, whose brothers then slew the Moslem. Muhammad marshaled his followers, blockaded the Banu Kainuka Jews in their quarter for 15 days, accepted their surrender, and bade them, 700 in number, depart from Medina and leave all their possessions behind. We must admire the restraint of Abu Sufyan, who after his unnatural vow waited a year before going forth to battle Muhammad again. Early in 625 he led an army of 3,000 men to the hill of Ohod, 3 miles north of Medina. 15 women, including Abu Sufyan's wives, accompanied the army and stirred it to fervor with wild songs of sorrow and revenge. Muhammad could muster only 1,000 warriors. The Moslems were routed. Muhammad fought bravely, received many wounds, and was carried half unconscious from the field. Abu Sufyan's chief wife Hind, whose father, uncle, and brother had been slain at Badr, chewed the liver of the fallen Hamza, who had slain her father, and made anklets and bracelets for herself from Hamza's skin and nails. Thinking Muhammad safely dead, Abu Sufyan returned in triumph to Mecca. 6 months later, the Prophet was sufficiently recovered to attack the Banu Nadir Jews, charging them with helping the Quraysh and plotting against his life. After 3 weeks' siege, they were allowed to emigrate, each family taking with it as much as a camel could carry. Muhammad appropriated some of their rich date orchards for the support of his household, and distributed the remainder among the refugees. He considered himself at war with Mecca, and felt justified in removing hostile groups from his flanks. In 626, Abu Sufyan and the Quraysh resumed the offensive, this time with 10,000 men, and with material aid from the Banu Qurayza Jews. Unable to meet such a force in battle, Muhammad defended Medina by having a trench dug around it. The Quraysh laid siege for 20 days. Then, disheartened by wind and rain, they returned to their homes. Muhammad at once led 3,000 men against the Banu Qurayza Jews. On surrendering, they were given a choice of Islam or death. They chose death. Their 600 fighting men were slain and buried in the marketplace of Medina. Their women and children were sold into slavery. The Prophet had by this time become an able general. During his 10 years in Medina, he planned 65 campaigns and raids, and personally led 27. But he was also a diplomat and knew when war should be continued by means of peace. He shared the longings of the refugees to see their Meccan homes and families, and of both refugees and helpers to visit again the Kaaba that had in their youth been the hearth of their piety. As the first apostles thought of Christianity as a form and reform of Judaism, so the Muslims thought of Mohammedanism as a change and development of the ancient Meccan ritual. In 628, Muhammad sent the Quraysh an offer of peace, pledging the safety of their caravans in return for permission to fulfill the rites of the annual pilgrimage. The Quraysh replied that a year of peace must precede this consent. Muhammad shocked his followers by agreeing. A 10 years' truce was signed, and the Prophet consoled his raiders by attacking and plundering the Khaybar Jews in their settlement 6 days' journey northeast of Medina. The Jews defended themselves as well as they could. 93 of them died in the attempt. The rest at last surrendered. They were allowed to remain and cultivate the soil, but on condition of yielding all their property and half their future produce to the conqueror. All the survivors were spared except Kinana, their chieftain, and his cousin, who were beheaded for hiding some of their wealth. Safiya, a 17-year-old Jewish damsel betrothed to Kinana, was taken by Muhammad as an added wife. In 629, the Medina Moslems, to the number of 2,000, entered Mecca peacefully, and while the Quraysh, to avoid mutual irritations, retired to the hills, Muhammad and his followers made 7 circuits of the Kaaba. The Prophet touched the black stone reverently with his staff, but led the Moslems in shouting, "There is no God but Allah alone." Meccans were impressed by the orderly behavior and patriotic piety of the exiles. Several influential Quraysh, including the future generals Khalid and Amr, adopted the new faith, and some tribes in the neighboring desert offered Muhammad the pledge of their belief for the support of his arms. When he returned to Medina, he calculated that he was now strong enough to take Mecca by force. The 10 years' truce had 8 years to run, but Muhammad alleged that a tribe allied with the Quraysh had attacked a Moslem tribe and thereby voided the truce in 630. He gathered 10,000 men and marched to Mecca. Abu Sufyan, perceiving the strength of Muhammad's forces, allowed him to enter unopposed. Muhammad responded handsomely by declaring a general amnesty for all but 2 or 3 of his enemies. He destroyed the idols in and around the Kaaba, but spared the black stone, and sanctioned the kissing of it. He proclaimed Mecca the holy city of Islam, and decreed that no unbeliever should ever be allowed to set foot on its sacred soil. The Quraysh abandoned direct opposition, and the buffeted preacher who had fled from Mecca 8 years before was now master of all its life. 4. Muhammad victorious, 630 to 632. His 2 remaining years, spent mostly at Medina, were a continuing triumph. After some minor rebellions, all Arabia submitted to his authority and creed. The most famous Arabian poet of the time, Ka'b ibn Zuhair, had written a diatribe against him, came in person to Medina, surrendered himself to Muhammad, proclaimed himself a convert, received pardon, and composed so eloquent a poem in honor of the Prophet that Muhammad bestowed his mantle upon him. In return for a moderate tribute, the Christians of Arabia were taken under Muhammad's protection and enjoyed full liberty of worship, but they were forbidden to charge interest on loans. We are told that he sent envoys to the Greek emperor, the Persian king, and the rulers of Hira and Ghassan, inviting them to accept the new faith. Apparently there was no reply. He observed with philosophic resignation the mutual destruction in which Persia and Byzantium were engaged, but he does not seem to have entertained any thought of extending his power outside of Arabia. His days were filled with the chores of government. He gave himself conscientiously to details of legislation, judgment, and civil, religious, and military organization. One of his least inspired acts was his regulation of the calendar. This had consisted among the Arabs, as among the Jews, of 12 lunar months, with an intercalary month every 3 years to renew concord with the sun. Muhammad ruled that the Moslem year should always consist of 12 lunar months, of alternately 30 and 29 days. As a result, the Moslem calendar lost all harmony with the seasons, and gained a year upon the Gregorian calendar every 32.5 years. The Prophet was not a scientific legislator. He drew up no code or digest, had no system. He issued edicts according to the occasion. If contradictions developed, he smoothed them with new revelations that sternly superseded the old. Even his most prosaic directives might be presented as revelations from Allah. Harassed by the necessity of adapting this lofty method to mundane affairs, his style lost something of its former eloquence and poetry. But perhaps he felt that this was small price to pay for having all his legislation bear the awesome stamp of deity. At the same time, he could be charmingly modest. More than once he admitted his ignorance. He protested against being taken for more than a fallible and mortal man. He claimed no power to predict the future or to perform miracles. However, he was not above using the method of revelation for very human and personal ends, as when a special message from Allah sanctioned his desire to marry the pretty wife of Zaid, his adopted son. His 10 wives and 2 concubines have been a source of marvel, merriment, and envy to the Western world. We must continually remind ourselves that the high death rate of the male among the ancient and early medieval Semites lent to polygamy in Semitic eyes the aspect of a biological necessity, almost a moral obligation. Muhammad took polygamy for granted and indulged himself in marriage with a clear conscience and no morbid sensuality. Aisha, in a tradition of uncertain authority, quoted him as saying that the 3 most precious things in this world are women, fragrant odors, and prayers. Some of his marriages were acts of kindness to the destitute widows of followers or friends, as in the case of Omar's widow Hafsa. Some were diplomatic marriages, as in the case of Hafsa, to bind Omar to him, and the daughter of Abu Sufyan, to win an enemy. Some may have been due to a perpetually frustrated hope for a son. All his wives after Khadijah were barren, which subjected the Prophet to much raillery. Of the children born to him by Khadijah, only one survived him, Fatima. Mary, a Coptic slave presented to him by the Negus of Abyssinia, rejoiced him in the last year of his life with a son. But Ibrahim died after 15 months. His crowded harem troubled him with quarrels, jealousies, and demands for pin money. He refused to indulge the extravagance of his wives, but he promised them paradise, and for a time he dutifully spent a night with each of them in rotation. The master of Arabia had no apartment of his own. The alluring and vivacious Aisha, however, won so many attentions out of her turn that the other wives rebelled until the matter was settled by a special revelation. Thou canst defer whom thou wilt of them, and receive of them whom thou wilt. And whomsoever thou desirest of those whom thou hast set aside, it is no sin for thee. That is better, that they may be comforted and not grieve, and may all be pleased with what thou givest them. Women and power were his only indulgence. For the rest he was a man of unassuming simplicity. The apartments in which he successively dwelt were cottages of unburnt brick, 12 or 14 feet square, 8 feet high, and thatched with palm branches. The door was a screen of goat or camel hair. The furniture was a mattress and pillows spread upon the floor. He was often seen mending his clothes or shoes, kindling the fire, sweeping the floor, milking the family goat in his yard, or shopping for provisions in the market. He ate with his fingers and licked them thriftily after each meal. His staple foods were dates and barley bread, milk and honey were occasional luxuries, and he obeyed his own interdiction of wine. Courteous to the great, affable to the humble, dignified to the presumptuous, indulgent to his aides, kindly to all but his foes, so his friends and followers describe him. He visited the sick and joined any funeral procession that he met. He put on none of the pomp of power, rejected any special mark of reverence, accepted the invitation of a slave to dinner, and asked no service of a slave that he had time and strength to do for himself. Despite all the booty and revenue that came to him, he spent little upon his family, less upon himself, much in charity. But like all men, he was vain. He gave considerable time to his personal appearance, perfumed his body, painted his eyes, dyed his hair, and wore a ring inscribed, "Mohammed the Messenger of Allah." Perhaps this was for signing documents. His voice was hypnotically musical. His senses were painfully keen. He could not bear evil odors, jangling bells, or loud talk. "Be modest in thy bearing," he taught, "and subdue thy voice. Lo, the harshest of all voices is that of the ass." He was nervous and restless, subject to occasional melancholy, then suddenly talkative and gay. He had a sly humor. To Abu Huraira, who visited him with consuming frequency, he suggested, "O Abu Huraira, let me alone every other day, that so affection may increase." He was an unscrupulous warrior and a just judge. He could be cruel and treacherous, but his acts of mercy were numberless. He stopped many barbarous superstitions, such as blinding part of a herd to propitiate the evil eye, or tying a dead man's camel to his grave. His friends loved him to idolatry. His followers collected his spittle, or cut his hair, or the water in which he had washed his hands, expecting from these objects magic cures for their infirmities. His own health and energy had borne up well through all the tasks of love and war. But at the age of 59 he began to fail. A year previously, he thought, the people of Khaybar had served him poisonous meat. Since then he had been subject to strange fevers and spells. In the dead of night, Aisha reported he would steal from the house, visit a graveyard, ask forgiveness of the dead, pray aloud for them, and congratulate them on being dead. Now, in his 63rd year, these fevers became more exhausting. One night Aisha complained of a headache. He complained of one also, and asked playfully would she not prefer to die first, and have the advantage of being buried by the Prophet of Allah, to which she replied, with her customary tartness, that he would doubtless, on returning from her grave, install a fresh bride in her place. For 14 days thereafter the fever came and went. 3 days before his death, he rose from his sickbed, walked into the mosque, saw Abu Bakr leading the prayers in his stead, and humbly sat beside him during the ceremony. On June 7th, 632, after a long agony, he passed away, his head on Aisha's breast. If we judge greatness by influence, he was one of the giants of history. He undertook to raise the spiritual and moral level of a people harassed into barbarism by heat and foodless wastes, and he succeeded more completely than any other reformer. Seldom has any man so fully realized his dream. He accomplished his purpose through religion, not only because he himself was religious, but because no other medium could have moved the Arabs of his time. He appealed to their imagination, their fears and hopes, and spoke in terms that they could understand. When he began, Arabia was a desert flotsam of idolatrous tribes. When he died, it was a nation. He restrained fanaticism and superstition, but he used them. Upon Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and his native creed, he built a religion simple and clear and strong, and a morality of ruthless courage and racial pride, which in a generation marched to 100 victories, in a century to empire, and remains to this day a virile force through half the world. The Qur'an. 1. Form. The word Qur'an, Qur'an, means a reading or discourse, and is applied by Muslims to the whole or to any section of their sacred scriptures. Like the Jewish-Christian Bible, the Qur'an is an accumulation, and orthodoxy claims it to be in every syllable inspired by God. Unlike the Bible, it is proximately the work of one man, and is therefore without question the most influential book ever produced by a single hand. At various times in the last 23 years of his life, Muhammad dictated some fragment of this revelation. Each was written upon parchment, leather, palm leaves, or bones, was read to an assembly, and was deposited in various receptacles with preceding revelations, with no special care to keep them in logical or chronological order. No collection of these fragments was made in the Prophet's lifetime, but several Muslims knew them all by heart and served as living texts. In the year 633, when many of these Qur'an had died and were not being replaced, the Caliph Abu Bakr ordered Muhammad's chief amanuensis, Zayd ibn Thabit, to search out the Qur'an and bring it together. He gathered the fragments, says tradition, from date leaves and tablets of white stone and the breasts of men. From Zayd's completed manuscript, several copies were made. But as these had no vowels, public readers interpreted some words variously, and diverse texts appeared in different cities of the spreading Moslem realm. To stop this confusion, the Caliph Othman commissioned Zayd and 3 Quraysh scholars to revise Zayd's manuscript in 651. Copies of this official revision were sent to Damascus, Kufa, and Basra, and since then the text has been preserved with unparalleled purity and reverential care. The nature of the book doomed it to repetition and disorder. Each passage taken separately fulfills an intelligible purpose, states a doctrine, dictates a prayer, announces a law, denounces an enemy, directs a procedure, tells a story, calls to arms, proclaims a victory, formulates a treaty, appeals for funds, regulates ritual, morals, industry, trade, or finance. But we are not sure that Muhammad wanted all these fragments gathered into one book. Many of them were arguments to the man or the moment. They can hardly be understood without the commentary of history and tradition. And none but the faithful need expect to enjoy them all. The 114 chapters, or surahs, are arranged not in the order of their composition, which is unknown, but in the order of their decreasing length. Since the earlier revelations were generally shorter than the later ones, the Qur'an is history in reverse. The Medina surahs, prosaic and practical, appear first. The Mecca surahs, poetic and spiritual, appear last. The Qur'an puts its worst foot forward and should be begun at the end. All the surahs except the first take the form of discourses by Allah or Gabriel to Muhammad, his followers, or his enemies. This was the plan adopted by the Hebrew prophets and in many passages of the Pentateuch. Muhammad felt that no moral code would win obedience adequate to the order and vigor of a society unless men believed the code to have come from God. The method lent itself well to a style of impassioned grandeur and eloquence, at times rivaling Isaiah. Muhammad used a mode of utterance half poetry, half prose. Rhythm and rhyme are pervasive in it, but irregular, and in the early Meccan surahs there is a sonorous cadence and bold sweep of style that are completely felt only by those familiar with the language and sympathetic with the creed. The book is in the purest Arabic, rich in vivid similes, and too florid for Occidental taste. By general consent, it is the best as well as the first work in the prose literature of Arabia. 2. Creed. A religion is, among other things, a mode of moral government. The historian does not ask if a theology is true. Through what omniscience might he judge? Rather, he inquires what social and psychological factors combined to produce the religion, how well it accomplished the purpose of turning beasts into men, savages into citizens, and empty hearts into hopeful courage and minds at peace, how much freedom it still left to the mental development of mankind, and what was its influence in history. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam assumed that the first necessity for a healthy society is belief in the moral government of the universe, belief that even in the heyday of evil, some beneficent intelligence, however unintelligibly, guides the cosmic drama to a just and noble end. The three religions that helped to form the medieval mind agreed that this cosmic intelligence is one supreme God. Christianity added, however, that the one God appears in three distinct persons. Judaism and Islam considered this a disguised polytheism and proclaimed with passionate emphasis the unity and singleness of God. The Qur'an devotes a whole surah to this theme. The Muslim muezzin chants it daily from 100,000 minarets. Allah is, first of all, the source of life and growth and all the blessings of the earth. Says Muhammad's Allah to Muhammad, "Thou seest the earth barren, but when we send down water thereon, it doth thrill and swell, and put forth every lovely kind. Let man consider his food, how we pour water in showers, then split the earth in clefts, and cause the grain to grow therein, and grapes and green fodder, and olive and palm trees, and garden closes of thick foliage. Look upon the fruit thereof, and upon its ripening. Lo, herein verily are portents for a people who believe." Allah is also a God of power, who raised up the heavens without visible support, and ordereth the course of the sun and moon, and spread out the earth, and placed therein firm hills and flowing streams. Or in the famous throned verse, "Allah, there is no God save him, the living, the eternal. Neither slumber nor sleep overtaketh him. Unto him belongeth whatsoever is in the earth. Who is he that intercedeth with him save by his leave? He knoweth that which is in front of them and that which is behind them. His throne includeth the heavens and the earth, and he is never weary of preserving them. He is the sublime, the tremendous." But along with his power and justice goes everlasting mercy. Every chapter of the Qur'an, except the 9th, like every orthodox Muslim book, begins with a solemn prelude, called Bismillah from its first words, "In the name of God the Compassionate, the Merciful." And though Muhammad stresses the terrors of hell, he never tires of praising the infinite mercy of his God. Allah is an omniscient deity and knows our most secret thoughts. "Verily we created man, and we know what his soul whispereth to him, for we are nearer to him than the vein in his neck." Since Allah knows the future as well as the present and the past, all things are predestined. Everything has been decreed and fixed from all eternity by the divine will, even to the final fate of every soul. Like Augustine's God, Allah not only knows from eternity who will be saved, but sendeth whom he will astray and guideth whom he will. As Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, so Allah says of unbelievers, "We have thrown veils over their hearts, lest they should understand the Qur'an, and into their ears a heaviness. And if thou bid them to the guidance, yet even then they will never be guided." This, doubtless intended as a spur to belief, is a hard saying in any religion, but Muhammad thrusts it down with more than Augustinian thoroughness. "Had we pleased," says Allah, "we had certainly given to every soul its guidance. But true shall be the word that has gone forth from me. I will surely fill hell with jinn, or demons, and men together." Once, says a tradition ascribed to Ali, "we were sitting with the Prophet, and he wrote with a stick on the ground, saying, 'There is not one among you whose sitting place is not written by God, whether in fire or in paradise.'" This belief in predestination made fatalism a prominent feature in Muslim thought. It was used by Muhammad and other leaders to encourage bravery in battle, since no danger could hasten, nor any caution defer the predestined hour of each man's death. It gave the Moslem a dignified resignation against the hardships and necessities of life. But it conspired with other factors to produce in later centuries a pessimistic inertia in Arab life and thought. The Qur'an fills out its supernatural world with angels, jinn, and a devil. The angels serve as Allah's secretaries and messengers, and record the good and wicked deeds of men. The jinn are genii made out of fire. Unlike the angels, they eat, drink, copulate, and die. Some are good and listen to the Qur'an, most are bad, and spend their time getting human beings into mischief. The leader of the evil jinn is Iblis, who was once a great angel, but was condemned for refusing to pay homage to Adam. The ethic of the Qur'an, like that of the New Testament, rests on the fear of punishment and the hope of reward beyond the grave. The life of the world is only play and idle talk and pageantry. Only one thing is certain in it, and that is death. Some Arabs thought that death ends all and laughed at theories of an afterlife as naught but fables of the men of old. But the Qur'an vouches for the resurrection of body and soul. Resurrection will not come at once. The dead will sleep till Judgment Day, but because of their sleep, their awaking will seem to them immediate. Only Allah knows when this general resurrection will take place, but certain signs will herald its coming. In those last days, faith and religion will have decayed. Morals will be loosened into chaos. There will be tumults and seditions and great wars, and wise men will wish themselves dead. The final signal will be 3 trumpet blasts. At the first blast, the sun will go out, the stars will fall, the heavens will melt, All buildings and mountains will be leveled with the earth and its plains, and the seas will dry up or burst into flame. At the second blast, all living creatures, angels or jinn or men, will be annihilated, except a few favored of God. 40 years later, Israfel, the angel of music, will blow the third blast. Then dead bodies will rise from the grave and rejoin their souls. God will come in the clouds, attended by angels bearing the books of all men's deeds, words, and thoughts. The good works will be weighed in a scale against the bad, and each man will so be judged. The inspired prophets will denounce those who rejected their message and will intercede for those who believed. The good and bad alike will move out upon the bridge Al-Sirat, which, finer than a hair and sharper than the edge of a sword, is suspended over the chasms of hell. The wicked and unbelievers will fall from it. The good will pass over it safely into paradise, not through their own merits, but only through the mercy of God. The Qur'an, like the fundamentalist forms of Christianity, seems more concerned with right belief than with good conduct. 100 times it threatens with hell those who reject Muhammad's appeal. Sins being diverse in degree and kind, there are 7 levels in hell, each with punishments adjusted to the offense. There will be burning heat and biting cold. Even the most lightly punished will wear shoes of fire. The drink of the damned will be boiling water and filth. Perhaps Dante saw some of his visions in the Qur'an. Unlike Dante's, Muhammad's picture of heaven is as vivid as his description of hell. Good believers will go there, and those who die for Allah's cause in war, and the poor will enter 500 years before the rich. Paradise is in or above the 7th astronomic heaven. It is one vast garden, watered with pleasant rivers and shaded with spreading trees. The blessed there will be dressed in silk brocades and be adorned with gems. They will recline on couches, be served by handsome youths, and eat fruit from trees, bowing down to fill their hands. There will be rivers of milk, honey, and wine. The saved will drink wine, forbidden on earth, from silver goblets, and will suffer no after-effects. By the mercy of Allah there will be no speeches at these heavenly banquets. Instead there will be virgins never yet touched by man or jinn, in beauty like the jacinth and coral stone. With swelling bosoms but modest gaze, with eyes as fair and pure as sheltered eggs, and bodies made of musk, and free from the imperfections and indignities of mortal flesh. Each blessed male will have 72 of these houris for his reward, and neither age nor weariness nor death shall mar the loveliness of these maidens or their comrades' bliss. Since pious and believing women will also enter paradise, some confusion might result, but such difficulties would not be insuperable to men accustomed to polygamy. To these sensual pleasures Muhammad added certain spiritual delights. Some of the saved will prefer to recite the Qur'an, and all of them will experience the supreme ecstasy of beholding Allah's face. And round about them shall go children, never growing old. Who could reject such a revelation? 3. Ethics. In the Qur'an, as in the Talmud, law and morals are one. The secular is included in the religious, and every commandment is of God. Here are rules not only for manners and hygiene, marriage and divorce, and the treatment of children, slaves, and animals, but also for commerce and politics, interest and debts, contracts and wills, industry and finance, crime and punishment, war and peace. Muhammad did not disdain commerce. He was its graduate. Even in his sovereign Medina days, says a tradition, he bought wholesale, sold retail, and made profit without qualm. Sometimes he acted as auctioneer. His language was rich in commercial metaphors. He promised worldly success to good Muslims and offered heaven as a bargain for a little belief. He threatened hell to lying or cheating merchants, denounced monopolists and speculators who keep back grain to sell at a high rate, and bade the employer give the laborer his wage before his perspiration dries. He prohibited the taking or giving of interest. No reformer ever more actively taxed the rich to help the poor. Every will was expected to leave something to the poor. If a man died intestate, his natural heirs were directed to give a part of their inheritance to charity. Like his religious contemporaries, he accepted slavery as a law of nature, but did what he could to mitigate its burdens and its sting. In like manner, he improved the position of woman in Arabia while accepting her legal subjection with equanimity. We find in him the usual quips of the male resenting his enslavement to desire. Almost like a father of the church, he speaks of women as man's supreme calamity, and suspects that most of them will go to hell. He made his own Salic law against women rulers. He allowed women to come to the mosque, but believed that their homes are better for them. Yet when they came to his services, he treated them kindly, even if they brought suckling babes. If, says an amiable tradition, he heard a child cry, he would shorten his sermon lest the mother be inconvenienced. He put an end to the Arab practice of infanticide. He placed woman on the same footing with man in legal processes and in financial independence. She might follow any legitimate profession, keep her earnings, inherit property, and dispose of her belongings at will. He abolished the Arab custom of transmitting women as property from father to son. Women were to inherit half as much as the male heirs, and were not to be disposed of against their will. A verse in the Qur'an seems to establish purdah. Stay in your houses and do not display your finery. But the emphasis here was on modesty of dress, and a tradition quotes the Prophet as saying to women, "It is permitted you to go out for your needs." With regards to his own wives, he asked his followers to speak to them only from behind a curtain. Subject to these restrictions, we find Moslem women moving about freely and unveiled in the Islam of his time and a century thereafter. Morals are in part a function of climate. Probably the heat of Arabia intensified sexual passion and precocity, and some allowance should be made for men in perpetual heat. Moslem laws were designed to reduce temptation outside of marriage and increase opportunity within. Premarital continence was strictly enjoined, and fasting was recommended as an aid. The consent of both parties was required for marriage. That agreement, duly witnessed and sealed with a dowry from bridegroom to bride, sufficed for legal marriage, whether the parents consented or not. A Moslem male was allowed to marry a Jewish or Christian woman, but not an idolatress, that is, a non-Christian polytheist. As in Judaism, celibacy was considered sinful, marriage obligatory and pleasing to God. Muhammad accepted polygamy to balance a high death rate in both sexes, the length of maternal nursing, and the early waning of reproductive powers in hot climes. But he limited the number of permitted wives to 4, allowing himself a special dispensation. He forbade concubinage, but held it preferable to marriage with an idolatress. Having allowed the male so many outlets for desire, the Qur'an punished adultery with 100 stripes on each sinner. But when, on flimsy grounds, Muhammad's favorite wife Aisha was suspected of adultery and gossip persistently besmirched her name, he had a trance and issued a revelation requiring 4 witnesses to prove adultery. Moreover, those who accuse honorable women but bring not 4 witnesses shall be scourged with 80 stripes, and their testimony shall never again be accepted. Accusations of adultery were rare thereafter. Divorce was permitted to the male by the Qur'an, as by the Talmud, on almost any ground. The wife might divorce her husband by returning her dowry to him. While accepting the pre-Islamic liberty of divorce for the male, Muhammad discouraged it, saying that nothing was so displeasing to God. Arbiters should be appointed, one from his folk and one from hers, and every effort made at reconciliation. 3 successive declarations at monthly intervals were required to make a divorce legal, and to compel careful thought about it, the husband was not allowed to remarry his divorced wife until after she had been married and divorced by another man. The husband must not go into his wife during her periods. She was not to be considered unclean at that time, but she must purify herself ritually before resuming cohabitation. Women are a tilth to man, a field to be cultivated. It is an obligation of the man to beget children. The wife should recognize the superior intelligence and therefore superior authority of the male. She must obey her husband. If she rebels, he should banish her to a bed apart and scourge her. Every woman who dieth and her husband is pleased with her shall enter paradise. Here, as elsewhere, the legal disabilities of women barely matched the power of their eloquence, their tenderness, and their charms. Omar, the future caliph, rebuked his wife for speaking to him in a tone that he considered disrespectful. She assured him that this was the tone in which his daughter Hafsa and the other wives of Muhammad spoke to the Prophet of Allah. Omar went at once and remonstrated with Hafsa and another of Muhammad's wives. He was told to mind his business, and he retired in dismay. Hearing of all this, Muhammad laughed heartily. Like other Moslems, he quarreled now and then with his wives, but he did not cease to be fond of them, or to speak of women with becoming sentiment. The most valuable thing in the world, he is reported to have said, is a virtuous woman. Twice in the Qur'an he reminded Moslems that their mothers had carried them with pain, brought them forth with pain, nursed them for 24 or 30 months. Paradise, he said, is at the foot of the mother. 4. Religion and the State. The greatest problems of the moralist are first to make cooperation attractive, and then to determine the size of the whole or group with which he will counsel preeminent cooperation. A perfect ethic would ask the paramount cooperation of every part with the greatest whole, with the universe itself, or its essential life and order, or God. On that plane, religion and morality would be one. But morality is the child of custom and the grandchild of compulsion. It develops cooperation only within aggregates equipped with force. Therefore, all actual morality has been group morality. Muhammad's ethic transcended the limits of the tribe in which he was born, but was imprisoned in the creedal group which he formed. After his victory in Mecca, he restricted, but could not quite abolish, the plundering raids of tribe against tribe, and gave to all Arabia, implicitly to all Islam, a new sense of unity, a wider orbit of cooperation and loyalty. The believers are naught else than brothers. Distinction of rank or race, so strong among the tribes, was diminished by similarity of belief. If a Negro slave is appointed to rule you, hear and obey him, though his head be like a dried grape. It was a noble conception that made one people of diverse nations scattered over the continents. This is the glory of both Christianity and Islam. But to that transcendent love, in both religions, corresponded an astringent antagonism to all who would not believe. Take not the Jews and the Christians for friends. Choose not your fathers nor your brothers for friends if they take pleasure in disbelief rather than in faith. Muhammad interpreted these principles with some moderation. Let there be no violence in religion. If they embrace Islam, they are surely directed, but if they turn their backs, verily to thee belongs preaching only. Give a respite to the disbelievers. Deal thou gently with them for a while. But against Arab unbelievers who did not peaceably submit, Muhammad preached the jihad, or holy war, a crusade in the name of Allah. After the war with the Quraysh had begun, and when the sacred months of truce were past, enemy unbelievers were to be killed wherever found. But if any of the idolaters seeketh thy protection, then protect him that he may hear the word of Allah. If they repent and establish worship, that is, accept Islam, then leave their way free. Kill not the old man who cannot fight, nor young children nor women. Every able-bodied male in Islam must join in the holy war. Lo, Allah loveth those who battle for his cause. I swear by Allah that marching about morning and evening to fight for religion is better than the world and everything in it. And verily the standing of one of you in the line of battle is better than supererogatory prayers performed in your house for 60 years. This war ethic, however, is no general incitement to war. Fight in the way of Allah against those who fight against you, but begin not hostilities. Allah loveth not aggressors. Muhammad accepts the laws of war as practiced by the Christian nations of his time, and wages war against Quraysh unbelievers holding Mecca precisely as Urban II would preach a crusade against Muslims holding Jerusalem. The inevitable gap between theory and practice seems narrower in Islam than in other faiths. The Arabs were sensual, and the Qur'an accepted polygamy. Otherwise, the ethic of the Qur'an is as sternly Puritan as Cromwell's. Only the uninformed think of Mohammedanism as a morally easy creed. The Arabs were prone to vengeance and retaliation, and the Qur'an made no pretense at returning good for evil. And one who attacks you, attack him in like manner. Whoso defendeth himself after he hath suffered wrong, there is no way of blame against them. It is a virile ethic, like that of the Old Testament. It stresses the masculine, as Christianity stressed the feminine virtues. No other religion in history has so consistently tried to make men strong, or so generally succeeded. O ye who believe, endure, outdo all others in endurance. Thus also spake Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Revered to the edge of idolatry, copied and illuminated with loving skill and care, used as the book from which the Moslem learned to read, and then again as the core and summit of his education, the Qur'an has for 13 centuries filled the memory, aroused the imagination, molded the character, and perhaps chilled the intellect of hundreds of millions of men. It gave to simple souls the simplest, least mystical, least ritualistic of all creeds, free from idolatry and sacerdotalism. Its message raised the moral and cultural level of its followers, promoted social order and unity, inculcated hygiene, lessened superstition and cruelty, bettered the condition of slaves, lifted the lowly to dignity and pride, and produced among Moslems, barring the revels of some caliphs, a degree of sobriety and temperance unequaled elsewhere in the white man's world. It gave men an uncomplaining acceptance of the hardships and limitations of life, and at the same time stimulated them to the most astonishing expansion in history. And it defined religion in terms that any Orthodox Christian or Jew might accept. Righteousness is not that ye turn your faces to the east or to the west, but righteousness is this: whosoever believeth in God, and the last day, and the angels, and the book, and the prophets, and whosoever for the love of God giveth of his wealth unto his kindred, unto orphans, and the poor, and the wayfarer, and to the beggar, and for the release of captives, and whoso observeth prayer, and when they have covenanted, fulfill their covenant, and who are patient in adversity and hardship, and in the times of violence, these are the righteous, these are they who believe in the Lord. 5. The sources of the Qur'an. As the style of the Qur'an is modeled on that of the Hebrew prophets, so its contents are largely an adaptation of Judaic doctrines, tales, and themes. The Qur'an, which excoriates the Jews, is the sincerest flattery they have ever received. Its basic ideas, monotheism, prophecy, faith, repentance, the Last Judgment, heaven and hell, seem Jewish in proximate origin, even in form and dress. It deviated from Judaism chiefly in insisting that the Messiah had come. Muhammad frankly reports contemporary accusations that his revelations were nothing but a fraud which he hath fabricated, and other people have helped him therein, dictating to him morning and evening. He generously accepts the Hebrew and Christian scriptures as divinely revealed. God has given man 104 revelations, of which only 4 have been preserved: the Pentateuch to Moses, the Psalms to David, the Gospel to Jesus, the Qur'an to Muhammad. Whoso rejects any of these is, in Muhammad's view, an infidel. But the first 3 have suffered such corruption that they can no longer be trusted, and the Qur'an now replaces them. There have been many inspired prophets, for example, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Enoch, Christ, but last and greatest, Muhammad. From Adam to Christ, Muhammad accepts all the narratives of the Bible, but occasionally amends them to save the divine honor. So God did not really let Jesus die on the cross. The prophet alleges the agreement of the Qur'an with the Bible as proof of his divine mission, and interprets various biblical passages as predicting his own birth and apostolate. From the creation to the Last Judgment, he uses Jewish ideas. Allah is Yahweh. Allah is a contraction of Al-Ilah, an old Kaaba god. A kindred word was used in various forms in divers Semitic languages to express divinity. So the Jews use Elohim, and Christ on the cross appealed to Eli. Both Allah and Yahweh are gods of compassion, but they are also stern and warlike deities, capable of many human passions, and resolved to have no other god besides them. The Shema Yisrael of the Jewish ritual, affirming the unity of God, is repeated in the first article of Muslim belief: there is no God but Allah. The Quranic refrain that Allah is gracious and compassionate echoes the same frequent phrase in the Talmud. The designation of Allah as Rahman, the Merciful, recalls the rabbinical use of Ramana for Yahweh in the Talmudic age. The Talmud loves to say, the Holy One, blessed be He. Muslim literature follows with the oft-repeated words, Allah, or Muhammad, blessed be He. Apparently the Jews who acquainted the prophet with the Bible also gave him snatches of the Talmud. 100 passages in the Qur'an echo the Mishnah and the Gemaras. The teachings of the Qur'an about angels, the resurrection, and heaven follow the Talmud rather than the Old Testament. Stories that make up a fourth of the Qur'an can be traced to Haggadic, or illustrative elements, in the Talmud. Where the Qur'an narratives vary from the biblical accounts, as in the story of Joseph, they usually accord with variations already existing in the Haggadic literature of the pre-Muslim Jews. From the Mishnah and Halakha, the oral law of the Jews, Muhammad seems to have derived many elements of ritual, even minute details of diet and hygiene. Ceremonial purification before prayer is enjoined, and the hands may be washed with sand if no water can be had, precisely the rabbinical formula. The Jewish institution of the Sabbath pleased Muhammad. He adopted it with a distinction in making Friday a day of prayer for the Muslims. The Qur'an, like the Mosaic law, forbids the eating of blood, or the flesh of swine or dogs, or of any animal that has died of itself, or has been killed by another animal, or has been offered to an idol. The Qur'an, however, allows the eating of camel's flesh, which Moses forbade, but which was sometimes the only flesh food available in the desert. The Muslim method of fasting followed the Hebrew model. The Jews were bidden by their rabbis to pray thrice daily, facing toward Jerusalem and the temple, and to prostrate themselves with forehead to the ground. Muhammad adapted these rules to Islam. The first chapter of the Qur'an, which is the basic prayer of Islam, is essentially Judaic. The lovely greeting of the Hebrew, Shalom Aleichem, parallels the noble peace be with you of Islam. Finally, the Talmudic heaven, like the Quranic paradise, is one of frankly physical as well as ecstatically spiritual delights. Some of these elements in creed and practice may have been a common heritage of the Semites. Some of them, angels, devils, Satan, heaven, hell, the resurrection, the last judgment, had been taken by the Jews from Babylonia or Persia, and may have gone directly from Persia to Islam. In Zoroastrian, as in Mohammedan eschatology, the resurrected dead must walk upon a perilous bridge over a deep abyss. The wicked fall into hell, the good pass into a paradise where they enjoy, among other dainties, the society of women, or houris, whose beauty and ardor will last forever. To Jewish theology, ethics, and ritual, and Persian eschatology, Muhammad added Arab demonology, pilgrimage, and the Kaaba ceremony, and made Islam. His step to Christianity was slighter. If we may judge from the Qur'an, he knew Christianity very imperfectly, its scriptures only at second hand, its theology chiefly in Persian Nestorian form. His earnest preaching of repentance in fear of the coming judgment has a Christian tinge. He confuses Mary, the Hebrew Miriam, the mother of Jesus, with Miriam, the sister of Moses, and, misled by the rising worship of Mary in Christendom, thinks that Christians look upon her as a goddess forming a trinity with the Father and Christ. He accepts several uncanonical legends about Jesus and the virgin birth. He modestly acknowledges the miracles of Jesus while making no claim to such powers for himself. Like the Docetists, he thinks that God put a phantom in Christ's place on the cross and drew him up to heaven unhurt. But Muhammad stopped short of making Jesus the Son of God. Far is it removed from Allah's transcendent majesty that he should have a son. He begs the people of the Scripture to come to an agreement between us and you that we shall worship none but Allah. All in all, despite deprecating in intimacy with them, Muhammad was well disposed toward Christians. Consort in the world kindly with Christians. Even after his quarrel with the Jews, he counseled toleration toward the people of the book, that is, the Jews and the Christians. Mohammedanism, though as fanatic as any faith, concedes that others than Muslims may be saved, and requires its followers to honor the law, the Old Testament, the Gospel, and the Qur'an as all constituting the Word of God. Here was a refreshing breadth of view. Muhammad adjures the Jews to obey their law, Christians to obey the Gospel, but he invites them to accept also the Qur'an as God's latest pronouncement. The earlier revelations had been corrupted and abused. Now the new one would unite them, cleanse them, and offer all mankind an integrating, invigorating faith. 3 books made and almost filled the age of faith: the Bible, the Talmud, the Qur'an, as if to say that in the rebarbarization of the Roman Empire only a supernatural ethic could restore order to society and the soul. All 3 books were Semitic and overwhelmingly Judaic. The drama of medieval history would be the spiritual competition of these scriptures and the bloody conflict of their creeds.